Hello everyone, my name is Richthofen. I'm very happy to be here to share a little part of my entire honors thesis, People's History of Alcohol Prohibition in Colorado, Labor, Class, Gender, and Moral Reform 1917 to 1933. I'm a history major and a German minor. Before we get into it, I want to actually just define some terms just so you can understand what I'm talking about as we're going. I'm specifically talking about alcohol prohibition in Colorado, which was a phenomenon that kind of started in the 1800s and actually passed federally in the 1920s. It was the belief that for public health reasons that people really couldn't choose for themselves to make good decisions, and so it should be up to the government to make things illegal so people don't make bad decisions. A word you might also hear me use throughout this is temperance. It's the same concept, except temperance is going to have more of a religious side to it, of the sense that the belief that alcohol is a sin. And that will also play into a lot of the legal history of Colorado as well. So my thesis is actually quite large. I was very interested, I've always been very interested in the 1920s and that sort of cultural shift between the Old West and the New West, what we see between Victorianism and the modern age. And it is my belief that through my own studies that it was alcohol prohibition that kind of pushed this social change. This is a pretty big project, so for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm actually just going to talk about a very underrepresented demographic in this study, women actually. Through my studies, I found in Colorado that women played an incredible role in prohibition. I've actually been able to do a lot of primary research and contribute to the field of Colorado history, so I'm very proud to be sharing with you today. So before I can talk about the 20s and the Jazz Age and all that, I have to give you some context to Colorado's history with alcohol. So when miners first came here in the 1860s, a saloon was built within a week. However, it took over 10 years for a school or a bank or a church to get built. That being said, alcohol from the get-go has had its place here in our culture. The first peoples that came here that were not native to the land, they were mostly unskilled laborers, young men looking for jobs in mines or in smelting factories. And this was before the time of labor laws, and so we have a lot of this pent-up masculinity, let's just say, in these mines for 14 hours a day. It's hard work, and these mining towns usually were very small and isolated in mountains, and so there wasn't much to do. And when you're exhausted and sick, sometimes all you want to do is just go get a drink. Saloons also provided spaces for political meetings. This is where a lot of unions met. This is also where we have a lot of gambling going on, as well as fighting, and mixing fighting and gambling, and alcohol. That being said, it became a very segregated space. At this time, this is the Victorian era, and while women are gaining more rights and trying to assert this fact that they're just as capable as men, there's still this really strong disconnect. There's this belief that women are capable and should be politically active, but they need to stay in the home, in the private sphere, that their role is to purify society from the inside out. And then the belief counter to that was that men were supposed to be out in public actually doing the work. And so in that way, saloons, just culturally, you almost never saw women in them. If you did see women in them, they were usually prostitutes. And so people who were starting to become concerned about alcohol at this time were seeing these factors come into play. Not just saloons, but alcohol in many ways has had a great impact on our history. Most of the miners or people who came to Colorado were actually from immigrant families. If they weren't miners, they often came as homesteaders with the Homestead Act, or they came to start their own businesses. Right here we have a picture from Tivoli. We were actually just in that building. Denver's largest foreign-born population came from Germany, actually. And so we had a lot of breweries, and it was a strong part of a lot of our culture. Like I mentioned, miner families and stuff, a lot of these cultures came from places where alcohol was super important to religious ceremonies or to funerals or to weddings or celebrations or just to, like I said, relax after a long, hard day. However, another side to it is one of the main employers of distributing alcohol throughout the state were actually children, which is very interesting. As I was talking about labor laws, we also had problems with child labor laws in Colorado. And so people who were starting to sort of notice this tension with alcohol in society, that one of the main points that they brought up was the amount of children that were involved with alcohol. Much like Newsies, you could go to Pueblo, for example, and see a kid on the corner like, hey, do you want a beer? And you could buy it. Well, technically, you could only buy it if you were a man. So, in 1901, this distinction in culture and this clash between what a woman is supposed to do came to law, actually. It's very ironic because Colorado was actually the first state to give women the right to vote in 1893. Yet in 1901, a law was passed barring women from entering saloons. Not only did it make it illegal for them to enter these establishments, it also made it illegal for them to purchase alcohol. It made it illegal for them to even work in buildings that sold alcohol. So that included hotels or, I mean, frankly, we're talking about Colorado at this time. That's a lot of places. So it was this kind of ironic thing where as a state we were like, okay, we believe that women can be educated and participate, yet we're going to just make sure that they don't. Daniel Cronin, I believe he's mentioned up here in the Cronin case. He was the owner of a Denver saloon, and he tried to sue the Colorado Supreme Court about this law. He was like, so you're saying that women are equal, but they're not equal. And they said, yep, that's what we mean. And they shut him down. He then tried to sue the U.S. Supreme Court about this, saying, hey, this is civil liberties problem. And they ruled against him as well. In the actual ruling, they said that every state has the right to discriminate against any race, gender, or class of person that they choose. So this is 1901, so we're having some problems with that still. This law to me shows the strong role that women have always played in Colorado when it comes to alcohol. And that's what I'm going to keep showing throughout this presentation, is that truly my belief in the research that I've found, and something that has hardly been talked about, is that in Colorado specifically, from start to finish, Prohibition was mostly campaigned for, participated in, and then repealed by women. So, getting to the point of Prohibition, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the most successful temperance groups that were anti-alcohol. They started in the 1800s, but they had a pretty strong foothold in the western states, specifically in Colorado as well. These were not what history up to this point tried to describe women as. These were very politically active, very educated, high society type people. These are people who were able to use their education and try to get their new voting rights to be involved in society and actually participate. Yet they still strongly believed that a woman's role was in the home. So again, it was this ironic that they were liberated, yet they wanted to keep their liberation within a separate sphere from men. Their belief was that alcohol itself was the main cause of problems in society. They saw with a lot of urbanization and mining towns and smelting that there was poverty and violence and all this sorts of, and child labor, as I mentioned. And rather than trying to think, well, maybe we need better labor laws, or, you know, it might be a societal problem, they tried to put a lot of the blame on alcohol itself as the main cause of it. They believed it was a slippery slope, and I would compare it to modern standards as they truly believed it was like a heroin or something that would, even one sip could just ruin your life. There was pro-alcohol sentiment at this time, but that was just you and me, the average person, the average minor, and so there wasn't really organized defense of alcohol, whereas the Women's Christian Temperance Union was incredibly organized and incredibly politically active, and so that in that way they were able to have a force for change. That being said, we cannot separate the ideology of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from their involvement in the KKK in Colorado. While not every single member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a member of the KKK, almost every single female member of the Colorado KKK was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. A lot of their ideologies are shared. For example, Lorena Center, the imperial commander of the Colorado Women's Ku Klux Klan, she was also one of the main leaders of the Colorado Women's Christian Temperance Union. They believed that alcoholism or cultures that used alcohol were genetically inferior. They believed that these immigrants who were coming into these mining jobs with their alcohol cultures were ruining Colorado or not American. And so the KKK and the Women's Christian Temperance Union hoped to pass prohibition in order to remove alcohol from these cultures and to Americanize and Christianize the nation. Well, that's where my research comes in. It's very ironic because we have this very strong movement towards this ideology, and actually Colorado did pass prohibition multiple years before the federal government did. We passed it in 1916, which the federal government passed it in 1920. And this western states were passing it about this time. Nebraska and Kansas were much earlier. But the reason this passed, again, like I said, was because of such organization. Yet the huge ironic part about it was that nobody listened. Actually, in fact, a lot of the movement of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was to protect women and children from alcohol. Yet through my research, I found that their own daughters were the ones who were the most likely to ignore it. We start seeing in Colorado this influx of these blazing headlines freaking out about women entering into the public and entering into these black markets. And like I said, I wanted to give that context to prior to this, women, or a good woman in Colorado probably wouldn't be allowed to be seen outside without an escort or without a male family member or somebody to protect them to be out there. Yet when we get prohibition, where alcohol is illegal for everybody, we start finally in Colorado seeing women going outside and going into these establishments. For the first time, we saw women entering into public spaces in Colorado. They could go into a speakeasy and order a drink mixed with every race, every gender, every class, and they were seen as equal and they could buy that. I find these headlines very funny. I've been looking at these for over a year and a half, sometimes like 30 in a day, so I sometimes forget what time I'm in. Women participated in alcohol prohibition in every aspect, from creation of the alcohol, to smuggling it, to bribing officers, to drinking it. They did everything. And in fact, they were less likely to face punishment for their crimes. The reason is, and there was even a case where a judge verbatim said, "You just are not capable of doing this." And the women at this time, who were obviously very capable of doing this and making quite a bit of money doing it, said, "Oh yeah, sure, I don't know what I'm doing," and they would just go back and keep doing it. They found clever ways to smuggle in alcohol to dances in their different outfits. We also, this really interesting story that has not been written about before, about these two women who lived together and actually ran an entire bootleg operation themselves, and they traveled between New Mexico and Creede, Colorado. Once they were finally arrested, part of their charge was actually because they were in drag. They were both wearing men's suits while they were trying to smuggle this alcohol. So that even more points to the demographic that cops were looking for. That being said, women had quite a bit of anonymity during this time. They were able to commit these crimes and make this money and participate in public, and people just didn't think they were able to do it. Yet they were, and they kept doing it. As we see here, there's an elderly woman who was charged for bootlegging crimes, but it was just as easy for women to go into spaces and order drinks. At this time, we also see a lot of newspaper articles of people busting women making gin in their own kitchens. Again, this is a clash between women's coming into the public and women still being seen as having to stay in the home. People weren't suspicious of women who were just in their kitchens cooking all day when they were just pumping out gallons after gallons of this bootleg and able to slip it out the back door, and they're like, well, we don't care about that. Interestingly enough, in response to this sort of taboo, this taboo of women going out there, bobbed hair, short skirts, braless, when their own mothers were trying to create laws that were a bit blurry between church and state. Colorado Police Department actually created purity squads, that's what they were called, in order to enforce this moral law. And again, it was almost impossible to enforce it because, again, nobody would listen, and these women would get out scotch-free. So they just continued doing it and helped change that culture. So, knowing this, the purity squads thought, you know what, maybe it's time for us to hire a woman to figure this out, because obviously we can't catch these women, they're too elusive. So this is Edith Barker. She was Denver's first female police officer. The Denver Police Department actually said to her face, you can be a cop and help us out, but we won't pay you because you're a woman. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union actually helped cover her salary for the first 2 years. And then after that, the Denver Police Department was like, okay, fine, you're awesome. She was given formal jiu-jitsu training as well as revolver training in her in these newspapers that talks that the bootleg squads would almost never go without her because she was such a good shot. She was also known as being a seducer of potential bootleggers. They were called mashers a lot. And she would charm them and be like, sure, I'll buy your alcohol, and she would tackle them and overpower them. And her buddies would come and arrest them. She's pretty cool. Like I said, this is actually, she's never been written about in Colorado history. This is a person that I came upon in the newspapers, and it blew my mind that this is an amazing historical marker in our own history that has just been forgotten to this point. On the other side of that, there was actually one cop that did notice that women were doing this, and he kind of started getting a little vendetta. This is John Smith. He was actually assigned as the Chief Prohibition Enforcement Officer of the entire state. He had no prior law enforcement experience. He was handpicked by Governor Sweet in 1921, and he used his neighbors, his sons, and his friends to be his deputies. And they were basically given free reign of the state. This is another individual with a top-ranking qualification, a Chief State Prohibition Enforcer, and he has not been written about in our history. He would sweep down into these mining towns where he would suspect there would be alcohol. So, you know, like I was talking about, these cultures, mining cultures or leisure cultures that used alcohol, and he would bust down doors with his rifle, and all his other deputies would hold everyone in the town hostage, including the cops in that town, and he would go around and smell everyone's breath and arrest them. Sometimes he would arrest 60 to 70 people at a time. There were many different lawsuits against him for civil liberties violations and, you know, doing things without a warrant or shooting people or humiliating them. He had a penchant for publicly humiliating people. He would tie people to chairs and whip them if they violated the prohibition law. These are actually some newspaper articles that I found in a scrapbook related to one of his deputies that was with him. Over half of the articles were about women. And he was one who knew that they were tricksy and trying to go under the law. And as we see here, a woman's income of $150 daily, that's $3,000 in today's terms. And so that's quite a lot, coming from a time where women were almost not even allowed to go outside of the home. They're like, well, F that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take advantage of this law. Oh, excuse me, before I get here. Something interesting about John is that these lawsuits against him came to no fruition until he tied another Denver cop to a chair and beat him with a belt. That he was then removed by the Civil Service Commission. Then Governor Sweet tried to remove the Civil Service Commission to keep John in power, and then the National Guard came in and removed everyone. So that being said, this was quite the lawless decade. So clearly, there was still a demand for alcohol. Everyone, not just women, were actively participating in alcohol, whether it was creating it, drinking it, selling it, anything. However, women in Colorado specifically played such an important role. In 1926, we became the first state to try to repeal the 18th Amendment, which is the Prohibition law. It was unsuccessful. Federal prohibition was repealed in 1933. And as you can see by these headlines, still people were a little jazzed about this nuanced woman, this new woman that completely, just in less than a decade, shifted from a moral, upstanding, corset-wearing Christian woman to a free, independent person who could go and make decisions for themselves in public. And I truly believe that alcohol prohibition was one of those main factors pushing that in our own state's history. Especially with how much Colorado is a brewery state today, and how much alcohol is such an important factor in so many of our lives. I think it's important to remember where we come from and the people who brought us to where we are today. I would say it's not taboo that women drink alcohol nowadays, yet it was crazy taboo not that long ago. And so I would encourage women to continue openly drink beer with gusto and to continue this wonderful legacy of our state. And I'd really like to thank my parents and my friends for being here today, as well as the honors program, this opportunity to conduct original research, as well as Dr. Meg Frisbee for being my advisor, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk.